Israel is holding yet another national election Tuesday, its fourth in 2 years, which comes after the country's parliament failed to pass a budget at the end of 2020. In this case, Israeli law calls for its parliament to be dissolved and for a new election to be held. Israel is already in political gridlock. The country currently has two leaders, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz. Both men have blamed one another for the latest government collapse. You may be wondering why Israel has held so many elections recently. It's because neither Prime Minister Netanyahu nor his opponents have been able to form a majority coalition, and that is a requirement in Israel. For more, let's bring in Dan Raviv. He is a columnist with Newsday and a former CBS News correspondent. He's also the author of Spies Against Armageddon: Inside Israel's Secret Wars. Dan, welcome back to CBSN. Great to see you. So walk us through what is currently going on in Israel. How did we get to where we are today, and what happens if there's no clear winner Tuesday?
Well, the main issue seems to be whether Benjamin Netanyahu gets to continue as prime minister. He's been prime minister for 12 straight years. He was even PM for a while in the 1970s. And he says he's the only one really qualified to lead this small country through all the crises, including COVID, where he claims a major success in getting a majority of Israelis inoculated. And indeed, Israel is a success when it comes to vaccination. And of course, all the other challenges, including trying to persuade President Joe Biden not to re-enter the nuclear accord with the U.S. So Netanyahu's been doing okay policy-wise. He's unpopular among many Israelis because he's been around too long, and also allegations of fraud. And he did form a coalition with his rival last year, Benny Gantz, after the election had no definite result. But Gantz, frankly, failed. And so his blue and white party is just really tiny right now. And Gantz is defense minister, but not an important player. There are others who hope that their parties can win tomorrow and they can be prime minister.
So, Dan, in many respects, this election is a referendum on Prime Minister Netanyahu. As you mentioned, Israel is among the world leaders in vaccine rollout. That was a huge success, and that's something that Mr. Netanyahu hopes people will reward him for. But his legal future could also be riding on this election, correct?
Yes, there's a corruption trial that already began. It's in recess right now. And one reason that he hopes to win re-election, that he can form a coalition that he'll lead, is because it's then expected that the Knesset or Parliament would pass an immunity law that you cannot put the prime minister on trial. But for now, he is charged with allegations, including offering bribes, working with a communications company, saying that he would help their business in exchange for favorable coverage, also receiving bribes, among other things, champagne and cigars that he got apparently from political supporters. And the allegation is that was in exchange for favors. And so these are bribery and fraud allegations. Of course, Netanyahu says he's innocent. It's another reason that many Israelis are sick and tired of him, though I keep hearing from Israelis who don't like him, don't like his policies of hanging on to the West Bank, captured in 1967 in that war. But those Israelis say, we don't see an alternative. We're not sure anybody else can run the country effectively.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu's biggest challengers this time around. Who are they? Where do they stand politically? And do they actually pose a viable threat to Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, it's always a game of forming a coalition. And so it's hard to say whether some other person may turn out to be prime minister, head of the coalition. But let's look at the leaders of the parties that are doing well in the opinion polls in Israel. For instance, we have a breakaway guy from the Likud party, from Netanyahu's party, Gideon Sa'ar. He leads a new party that he calls New Hope, and it's doing well in the polls, but maybe Sa'ar would just join Netanyahu in a new coalition. In the middle, you see Naftali Bennett. He's wealthy. He was in the tech industry and sold his company. He leads a party called New Right. What's most notable about him? He would run the economy very well, he says, and he would never give up the West Bank. He doesn't think that the Palestinians should have their own state, certainly not a powerful one, and Israelis are divided over what to do with the West Bank and Palestinians. And on the right, you see Yair Lapid, or you saw him. He's a former TV anchor, so he's a very good communicator. He seems to be very moderate. Not clear that he would give up the West Bank or how tough he would be in negotiating with the U.S., or Russia or the other countries for that matter. But many Israelis like Yair Lapid. And so keep in mind that no matter what it is, there's Lapid, no matter what it is, a coalition will have to be formed. And who has the most experience at forming a coalition? That would be Netanyahu, making deals, etc. So, Lapid has been a member of the coalition in the past. Still, most of the smart bets are on Netanyahu surviving this one again. Tanya.
And Dan, you have covered Israel for many years. Seldom, though, has the country been through a political gridlock like this. How important is this election for U.S. and Israeli relations going forward?
Yeah, political gridlock is a mess in any country, but Netanyahu has been really, really active. He had a lot of favors from his friend Donald Trump. Last year, Israel was able to forge diplomatic relations with 4 Arab and Muslim countries, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and most importantly, the very wealthy UAE, the United Arab Emirates. So Netanyahu is boasting. He's the guy who can bring Israel peace, relations with Arab countries, and then he says there won't be so much pressure on Israel to solve the Palestinian issue because they already have friendships with the Arab countries. So what about the U.S.? Well, Joe Biden wants to change the Biden administration, including Secretary of State Blinken. They'd like to see progress toward an Israeli-Palestinian resolution and negotiations. That's all been frozen. Trump didn't care, but President Biden does want progress there. So he's not speaking in very friendly terms toward Netanyahu. And so the U.S., the Biden administration, is waiting for the results of the Israeli election. And then we'll see whether the U.S. decides to be active on the Israeli-Palestinian front or sees that probably it'll still be Netanyahu. So what's the point of trying too hard? Tanya.
All right. Dan, Raviv, thank you so much for your time and your insight. We appreciate it.